may I give you the mic and present yourself and give us the webinar you promised on divine vengeance. Thank you.
So it's loading right now. Let's just start with what I was asked to do, namely the introduction of myself. As was said, I'm Arjan van den Os. I'm a assistant professor of New Testament at the Theological University of Apeldoorn. Before I was an assistant professor, I did two things. On the one side, I was a pastor at a Christian Reformed church in Spijkenisse, near the second city of the Netherlands, Rotterdam, or Rotterdam, as you say it in English. And on the other part of my my life and the side of my time was I was writing a dissertation, PhD dissertation, on the topic of today, divine vengeance in the New Testament, with a contextual, theological, and hermeneutical approach. As you may see this webinar. And so just a short introduction to sketch something of myself. My current research focuses on two sides also, the two-side man. First, I extend my research, which I've done on divine vengeance, also incorporating elements of judgment, of divine wrath. So I've written an entry into an encyclopedia of early Christianity on the biblical concept of judgment. I've written an article on divine wrath and also other things. So that will be the things I may do on the one side the coming years, and on the other side, I will focus on the notion of election in the New Testament. Also in New Testament, but also with the context of Qumran and that sort of thing. So that will be my occupation the coming years. But first we will focus on the topic which I've investigated extensively for the past 5 years, the notion of divine vengeance in the New Testament. Vengeance seems to be a topic which is quite unrelated to Christian faith and theology. Seems. But some of you may know that in the Bible, the notion of divine vengeance is present. The Bible forbids human vengeance, Leviticus 19:18, and also Romans 12:19. And some of you who I know that are trained in Apeldoorn may know that God in the Bible is also connected to vengeance. So it is not vacant or something like that. But the connection between God and vengeance seems to cause a lot of theological problems. Theological, but also hermeneutical. Because how can the God of love also be the God of vengeance? And how can the God who is just, whose prime occupation is doing justice, how can this God do something extra legal, such as vengeance? Because, as we will see, vengeance in our eyes is something which is done extra legal, outside of the just order of our world. This webinar will provide some insights into these problems based on the dissertation that I've written and defended also recently. I've defended my dissertation in April. As you can see on the PowerPoint, my webinar will be divided in some segments. First, I will give a short sketch on the context of my research, the research tradition and the context of my environment. Secondly, I will provide some first explorations, which you may call the hermeneutical aspect of this webinar. Also providing solutions which are already given to the problem of God and violence. Thirdly, we will focus on a very short sketch of divine vengeance in Greco-Roman contexts. Fourthly, the Old Testament and early Judaism and the notion of divine vengeance in these contexts. Fifth, and the most important part, of course, divine vengeance in the New Testament. And we will close this webinar of my part of the webinar in end this presentation with some observations. So first we go to my research tradition. I'm an assistant professor in Apeldoorn. And as said, you can get a transnational access fellowship to Apeldoorn. But if you want to apply, in which context, if you want to study the New Testament, or where do you come? What is the context in Apeldoorn? Well, as a biblical scholar, present biblical scholar, I'm embedded in the research group BEST, Biblical Exegesis and Systematic Theology. You can find the website in the PowerPoint. This research group consists out of two universities, the University of Apeldoorn, but also the University of Kampen Utrecht. And the name of the group says it all: Biblical Exegesis and Systematic Theology. We want to reconnect the relationship between biblical studies and systematic theology, a relationship which has been strenuous since the 18th century. This research group provides thorough exegetical work with theological offshoots, while also enabling systematic research based on the recent insights into biblical texts. So the research group consists out of scholars from Old Testament studies, New Testament studies, and systematic theology. And the dialogue between biblical scholars and systematic theologians has been fruitful, not only for ourselves and the questions that we ask, but also in several publications. And two of those you can find on the sheet. Books on scripture and the notion of sola scriptura, and also a book on the covenant that have been published by Brill in Leiden, and which can be obtained open access. So if you want to see what our research is, you can access it for free. Further works on Israel and the notion of love in the Bible and in systematic theology are in the process of editing and peer review, so they are coming hopefully. And research programs in the past have several focuses. For instance, the relationship between the oneness of God and the Trinity. And the last research program, which is ending in this year, was focused on love and the discriminating nature of love in the Bible. And in this program on love and the discriminating nature of love, my research was embedded. And before I go on, I also want to say some words on the tradition of Apeldoorn itself. The TUA, the acronym of the Theological University of Apeldoorn, the TUA has been a theological university for several decades now, and it has combined the heritage of the Reformation and its questions with theological inquiries into biblical texts and traditions. Scholars in Apeldoorn have been offering a theological interpretation of the Bible for decades. In my own field of New Testament studies, to name an example, Jan Versteeg, which photo you can see on the sheet. Jan Versteeg has written his dissertation on the relationship between Christ and the Spirit in the letters of Paul, in which he combines exegesis, thorough exegesis, with several theological questions and inquiries to be combined with this exegesis. So a short sketch of my research tradition and context, and if you want to apply for a TNA, you know where you will be found if you are accepted to get this fellowship. So after this sketch, we go to the first explorations, the hermeneutical part. I'm of course not the first one in theology who has noted the relationship between God and vengeance. Although I'm the first one writing a book on the notion of divine vengeance in the New Testament. But the more general category of God and violence has been studied quite thoroughly, especially for the last decades. And several hermeneutical solutions have also come up, which we will see in a short time. But why is vengeance problematic in itself? According to our modern Western eyes, and I speak from a Western context, vengeance in our modern eyes is something extra legal, outside of the just order which we have embedded within a justice system. Vengeance is something which is involved and surrounded by a sphere of excessiveness, of emotionality. Acts of vengeance are illegitimate. Acts of vengeance may open a vicious circle of violence. If one avenges, it opens the possibility of the other one taking vengeance, and so on and so on. We have put the notion of justice in the hands of judges because we say judges are more balanced. They do not have any emotional involvement in the case. They know their laws because they study for it, and they punish the perpetrator according to the laws which have been thought out through the decades and centuries. And we have given the responsibility over justice to these judges because we say they can infringe human rights justly and balancedly. The idea of divine justice is something in these secularized times as something quite absurd. God, is there even a God? And is justice really safe with him? We expect justice from real judges, which we can see in our courtrooms and that sort of thing. That is the idealized situation. Justice as something which is distributed by justice and which is not being exacted by human beings, and in which punishment is also according to the crime. But this ideal is sometimes contradicted to lived reality. In Belgium, there's a case now which involves the death of Sanda Dia, a student from the Catholic University of Leuven, in which the perpetrators of the murder are punished. But in society, many think and deem the punishment which the perpetrators have been given, a fine and some community service, much too lightly. So there's a sound and a sphere of we have to take justice in our own hands because justice is not safe with the judges themselves. So there, to sketch it, there's a tension between the ideal and the lived reality. But how do we come then to the biblical text? Well, I said it's a hermeneutical, so we read these texts in our own context. Which, by the way, is also a quite recent position, that vengeance is something extra legal, because vengeance for hundreds of years was a accepted means to distribute justice in the world. But then we come to those hermeneutical tensions, because if we read the Bible within the context of the ideal of vengeance, which is placed in the hands of judges and not in our hands, we come to in tension with the biblical text, which places vengeance in God's hands and vengeance as an accepted means of distributing justice. How can we resolve this tension? Well, some solutions have been given. First position is that divine vengeance is accepted in the Bible without any hesitation and without any regard to the hermeneutical tension. So in the time before 9/11, this was a quite accepted tradition, especially in evangelical circles, which we don't regard the tension between the Bible and our modern understanding. Second position is that divine vengeance in the Bible must be read in our context, but we also have to understand divine vengeance as the means of God to obtain the good. To name an example, the books of Paul Copen, an American scholar, they tend to go this way. God uses violence and vengeance to obtain the good. A third position is the position that God's vengeance is recognized and that the humanical tension is also observed, but that divine vengeance is considered to be a Jewish remnant. And this Jewish remnant is not something we have to consider legitimate right now, even in the New Testament, but also right now. This is the stance of someone like the German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher. And the fourth and last position is that God's vengeance is recognized, but we may not consider this to be a real depiction of God. What must distinguish between which is called the textual God and the actual God. So the God which we recognize in the text, the biblical text, and the God which is actually God, which is a God of love. An approach which can be found in works of someone like Eric Seibert. I hope to show that vengeance deserves more attention before we make any statements about God, and that the present solutions are not quite fitting. So we go to the context. First, the context of Greco-Roman society and literature. Before to understand divine vengeance in Greco-Roman context, we have to consider several important aspects of divine vengeance and Greco-Roman context. First, we have to understand the notion of honor, because honor was a quite significant cultural notion in antiquity. Honor defined who you were. Honor formed your identity, and honor formed the way you lived and your behavior. Honor was also present in religion. You had to honor the gods. The gods had honor on their own, and you were obliged to honor them. How did you obtain honor? How did the gods obtain honor? Well, several ways. You could inherit honor from your family. You could obtain honor through doing good deeds, or you could obtain honor through receiving a gift from someone that elevated you and gave you more status. Honor was quite tricky because honor could be challenged by someone, by an individual, by a group, on multiple occasions and in a multitude of ways. And your duty was to address this challenge and defend your honor, defend your status. Because if you didn't, the people who gave you honor and who recognized who you were and who valued your honor, who could be convinced that the challenge which you have received was legitimate. And if they deemed it legitimate, you could be degraded. You could lose your honor, you could lose your status. You were talked about in a negative way, and you could lose everything you had. And you have to answer these challenges, and these answers in antiquity were called vengeance or retribution. Retribution and vengeance is also an important word in reciprocity. Reciprocity was a system in Greco-Roman context of gift giving. Relations were built and maintained through the giving of gifts. Through giving a gift, the giver could enhance his or her sphere of influence and bring also more honor status to one, while the receiver of the gift would also receive more, would receive land or something else to expand one's status. This system was especially designed for the giver to give discriminately. Honor was also an important part of reciprocity. The receiver of a gift must be deemed worthy, must be deemed able to reciprocate the gift. Honor also comes into play in reciprocity when the gift was not accepted or when the gift was retributed with ingratitude. They didn't want the gift. That was a challenge to your honor, and you have to reciprocate. You have to answer this challenge to not lose your honor. And again, That means of reciprocation and retribution was vengeance. Other aspects of vengeance and cultural notions were the family. Vengeance was a form of family defense. Justice. Vengeance was an act of justice in that context. Emotion and also purity. Coming to divine vengeance, it was quite present in several. It was quite present in several texts, inscriptions, papyri, in mythology, in tragedy. There were special avenging gods, the Furies and the Erinyes, and even a doctrine of divine vengeance, Theodica. The gods would avenge themselves when you slighted their honor, when you did not give them honor, when they have given their blessings, but you did not reciprocate them. They would avenge when their people were attacked. And their vengeance is sometimes described as excessive, transgressing every boundary, being more intense than the slight they have received. They, as I said, they could also avenge when their people were attacked. And people had the right to ask vengeance to the gods when their honor, when their life was in danger. And to give an example and also a bridge to the Old Testament, I will give you a inscription which we have in Renaya, early Jewish, probably the 1st century before Christ, in which you can see those elements which I have mentioned. I call upon and pray to God the Most High, the Lord of the spirits and of all flesh, against those who have treacherously, in which you can see the notion of justice, murdered or poisoned the poor Heraclea, probably the daughter of the person who is praying, who died untimely and who have unjustly, notion of justice, shed her innocent blood. May the same happen to them who have murdered or poisoned her and to their children. Notion of family. Lord, you who see everything, and you, angels of God, for whom every soul humiliates itself on this day with supplications, hoping that you revenge her innocent blood and settle your account with them. Notion of reciprocity, as soon as possible. Then we go to the Old Testament. Much of the aspects which we have seen in the Greco-Roman world, we can also find in the Old Testament. But there are some differences. One of the main differences is that the Old Testament situates vengeance and the authority over vengeance with God. There is, as we may call it, a divine prerogative. And one of the texts which we can see this divine prerogative is Deuteronomy 32:35, a central text which plays a prominent role in early Judaism. And this text is vengeance is mine, says the Lord. God is the avenger. Psalm 94 is also an example of this. Also a difference, which is also continuity, is the notion of family. And the notion of family in the Old Testament is the covenant. The covenant is the main context in which the divine vengeance in the Old Testament plays a role. Not in all cases, but in most cases. God has a covenantal, familial relationship with the people of Israel. And this covenant and also the blessings of the covenant are the side of God's gift. There is not a full-blown system of reciprocity, but you can see reciprocation in the Old Testament. Vengeance in a covenantal context has two sides in the Old Testament. First, vengeance is used to warn the people of God. Vengeance as a warning. They must stay within the covenant. They must do the things they are obliged to do. The God of the covenant does not tolerate any unholy behavior because he is holy. Unholy behavior slights his honor and disregards his blessings, the gift of grace which he has given. To name a text, one can see that in Leviticus 26, 25, I will bring the sword on you to avenge the breaking of the covenant. Israel in the covenant is the family of God, and God is the head of the family. And that covenantal relationship comes with certain expectations. That is the reason, this reciprocity and this relationship is the reason that in the Old Testament, Israel is punished with exile, which is also referred to as God's vengeance in, for instance, Isaiah 1. And God uses instruments, other people, to exact his covenantal vengeance. In Jeremiah 50:51, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is explicitly mentioned as God's instrument of vengeance, as a warning, and also the execution of this warning. On the other side, in the Old Testament, divine vengeance is also turned against the enemies of the people. The other side of the covenant is that God stands up for his people. Isaiah, for instance, spends a lot of attention to those who attack the covenantal people of God, and Yahweh who gives the punishment to them for that attack. Isaiah 34, 8, for instance, but also 63, 4. Yahweh thus delivers his people from oppression. And if we give a short summary, divine vengeance in the Old Testament punishes and liberates. Going to early Judaism, we see continuity with the Old Testament. In all their diversity, they are the first recipients of the Old Testament. But we can detect some shifts, 2 shifts especially. First, there's a certain focus in early Judaism on God using instruments, more on human vengeance than on divine vengeance. The communities of Qumran, for instance, see themselves as God's forces. They are the instruments of God to exact his vengeance on the forces of darkness. But also books like First Maccabees and the book of Judith, they show that the faithful few could enforce God's vengeance on the wicked, because they have received the power of God to do that. God sometimes is mentioned as the sole authority of vengeance, but mostly the focus is on human appropriation of divine vengeance. Another shift you can see is that some early Jewish authors are quite embarrassed about the notion of divine vengeance in the Old Testament. Most prime example of that is Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria tries to defend his Jewish tradition and also define his Jewish tradition and religion by capturing Jewish thought, religion, texts into especially Platonic categories. Also with emotions and that sort of thing. And in some cases, he follows the biblical text, but on several occasions, he emphasizes that God is more forgiving than avenging. And in a lot of cases, he places the notion of divine vengeance in the hands of instruments, which he calls powers. And these powers mediate God's punishment in the world. And he gives this mediating position to these instruments because he deems he deems punishment as something evil, and God cannot be related to evil. And these instruments mediate God's punishment in the world so that God is refrained from any sort of evil violence. So he's quite embarrassed about the notion of divine vengeance in the Old Testament, because that is God doing violence and that is God doing evil. So he explains that that is God using instruments. So these 2 things shape the way in which early Judaism receives the Old Testament text. But coming to a summary, both in Old Testament and in early Jewish texts, divine vengeance is not something extra legal. something which is outside any legal boundaries. Divine vengeance is God's way to restore the balance of power. Divine vengeance is the way to restore his honor, the way to protect his people, the way to enforce his purity and his justice unto the world. And now we've seen the background, we go to the New Testament. And it will be fast, it will be something sketchy, but you will receive an idea of how divine vengeance in the New Testament then works. When we, first some general comments. When we read the New Testament text and look at the amount of text, we can see that the New Testament contains fewer references to divine vengeance than the Old Testament. But, and there's the big but, they are present. There are a lot of divine vengeance texts, and they are found in a lot of books in the New Testament. What does that say? Well, that divine vengeance and the notion of divine vengeance is not something trivial in New Testament thought, but as we will see, it may be a fundamental aspect of basic teaching of the New Testament, of the apostles, of the early Christian missionaries. So it's not something which can be found in the edges of New Testament thought, but probably it was a basic aspect of the teaching. We will first look at Luke Acts. And Luke Acts, the story of divine vengeance in Luke Acts really begins in a passage which does not contain the notion of divine vengeance, even omitted the notion of divine vengeance. That's the first sermon of Jesus in the synagogue of Nazareth in Luke 4. And this sermon contains an explicit citation of Isaiah 61. But it omits the last sentence of Isaiah 61, the days of vengeance. Why? Because this citation highlights the coming of God's favor in Jesus. God is giving the gift of his grace to the people of Israel in Jesus Christ and in his ministry. That this is true and that this is the case is also underlined by the parable of the vineyard in Luke 13. And the owner of the vineyard, God, has given the reddener of the vineyard, Jesus, some time to maintain the vines, Israel, before they are subjected to judgment. God has given his gift, reciprocity, but Israel have to show the appropriate reaction. And for Luke, that appropriate reaction is conversion, the realization that God is merciful, and the decision to live the life that God has pointed out. Yet, in the beginning of Luke, it also becomes evident that Jesus and the gift of God is not always recognized. He will be a stumbling block, as Simeon says. And it becomes evident in Luke that a lot of people in Israel, in the people of God, refuse to convert. They refuse to repent, which is a slight of God's gift. And that is the reason why Jesus in Luke 19 weeps over Jerusalem, and why Jesus states in Luke 21:22 that Jerusalem will be destroyed. And this destruction of Jerusalem is described by Jesus as the days of vengeance. That is telling. For Luke, then divine vengeance is God's reaction to unbelief, to even the oppression of his people, as Jesus says in Luke 21. So divine vengeance punishes those who do not believe and do not convert, but at the same time, it liberates God's people from oppression. And it is eschatological. It is God's reaction in the future. But in Acts, Luke makes clear that this eschatological reaction of God also becomes imminent, which can be seen in time. On several occasions, the death of Judas, the death of Ananias and Sapphira, the death of Herod, the blinding of Elymas or Bar Jesus. All these passages underline that God paves the way for the people, for his people, and takes away and punishes unbelief and refusal to repent. Divine vengeance for Luke thus is pivotal. It is God's reaction to oppression, unbelief, and it is God's restoration of his honor and justice in the world. For Luke, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament is not in antitheses. He continues the idea of divine vengeance and also gives it its rightful place in his narrative. Then Paul. In Paul, you can see the same two sides. Paul first uses divine vengeance as the way to warn his readers. One of the examples, 1 Thessalonians 4. In this passage, 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul warns the Thessalonians to not surrender themselves to porneia, which is untranslatable in my view. Why can't they transgress this boundary of porneia? That is not the will of God, he says. The will of God is the sanctification of his people. So vengeance is the way to warn his people, do not transgress the boundary of God. Again, in Romans 12:19, Paul admonishes his people to not transgress the boundary of God. They may not avenge themselves, but they have to do good. The reason why they cannot avenge is also given by Paul in Romans 12:19, because they are stepping on God's territory. Only God has the authority to avenge, which Paul underlines with the quotation of Deuteronomy 32. And it is God's way to do that. They must imitate how God has handled with them. They have slighted God by doing sin, which Paul makes clear in Romans 1-3. But God did not avenge himself on them. He has given his gift of Jesus Christ in his grace. And they must follow his example and not avenge. But, he says, God will avenge. And that is the message Paul communicates in Romans 12. It is God's covenantal reaction, but also liberation, implied also in Romans 12. And people in suffering, in times of oppression, Romans 5:3. And it is tempting in those times to cool your rage and cool your despair in vengeance. But Paul warns them, do not go down this path. Let God avenge you in the future, but also in the present. Because Paul says in Romans 13:4, God uses his instruments of the authorities of the justice system. So God's vengeance is both something of the future, but is also something of the present, although it is not fully God's vengeance. More explicit when it comes to divine vengeance as a motive of liberation is 2 Thessalonians 1. The suffering community there is comforted that Jesus will come down in the future, will exact his vengeance for slighting his honor and slighting the honor of the community. And that is the day and the moment where all the roles will be reversed. The oppressors become the oppressed and vice versa, and the oppressed will be glorified, will be given their respective honor. Going to Hebrews. Hebrews is mostly concerned with admonishment, with the community going the way of the Lord, because there is a situation in Hebrews that several Christ followers have apostatized, have left the community. And Hebrews sketches the situation that God has given his gift of grace in Jesus Christ. They have been glorified, they have been honored by God, that they have received the position of his family, of the covenant. Their behavior of apostatizing their behavior of leaving the community is a grave sin, according to the author of Hebrews. And the boundaries of this sin, the boundaries of the community are given in terms of divine vengeance in Hebrews 10:30. The use of the notion of divine vengeance in Hebrews has a purpose, namely that the author of Hebrews tries to divert the pathway of the community from which they are going now. Before they will meet God's eschatological vengeance, they now have the time to not slight the gracious gift of God in Jesus Christ and repent, convert, and go the way of the Lord. So, divine vengeance is something as a warning, as a promise that God will punish evil. At last, Revelation. Also, in Revelation, we meet several sovereign communities in Revelation 2 and 3. The main question of Revelation is given in Revelation 6:10. The question, when will you avenge us? That means, when will God exercise his judgment, and when will God impose his will and kingdom upon the world, and will impose his will and kingdom on the enemies of the early Christian communities? And in my view, this question in Revelation 6:10 functions as the hermeneutical key to Revelation, because everything what is described in Revelation after Revelation 6:10 must be seen as the unfolding of God's vengeance and judgment. The oppressors and those who refuse to repent and believe in God and also persevere are punished in a multitude of ways. And that eschatological punishment is near, because the day of the Lord is near, according to John. Punishment, so divine vengeance as punishment, but also as liberation from evil, and also a notion of rejoice, but also a warning: do not fall back in old habits, persevere, testify, and conquer. We have seen a lot, and we come to a conclusion. We have seen that divine vengeance is not something redundant in the New Testament, and also not in the Old Testament and early Judaism. Vengeance was something pivotal. But what is it really? Now, I've provided a definition in my dissertation of divine vengeance in the New Testament. The vengeance of God, that is the retributive, eschatological, legal, covenantal, and sometimes emotional reaction of God on those who inflict damage or suffering on him or his people, to eventually restore his and or his people's honor and purity and the balance of justice. Divine vengeance serves the two purposes which we have seen extensively. It admonishes the early Christian communities to follow the paths that God has pointed out, and it comforts that God will stand up for them when they suffer. Returning to the theology, does the notion of divine vengeance contradict God's love? Short answer, no. One can even say that God's love and divine vengeance is a form of God's love. Although one can define divine vengeance as a wounded love of God. God's love is not something cuddly or dearness. God is holy, God is king and judge. But there's a difference in balance. God's love is the permanent factor in God's person, God's actions, while divine vengeance, God's vengeance, is something more variable. It depends on the behavior of people. So there's a difference in balance, that in which love is more than vengeance. Neither is vengeance something contradicted by justice. Divine vengeance in the New Testament is a form of justice. God is judge, and his judgment is pure and reasonable. Also, there's no contrast between God of the Old Testament and God in the New Testament. There are differences, but they are minor, and there's more continuity. Through my whole story, you may have noticed that I've also already positioned myself hermeneutically and theologically. My position is again two-sided. First, I admit there's some tension between our understanding of vengeance and divine vengeance in the Bible. That's something which is quite obvious, I think. And New Testament authors would also not deny this. But, secondly, divine vengeance is quite necessary in theology of nowadays. A rehabilitation of divine vengeance, I say. The authors of the Bible deemed it necessary to include a divine vengeance in their writings because evil is persistent. Evil cannot be conquered by one individual. The vengeance of God assures that evil will not be victorious in the end, and that pure justice and peace will be given in the future. When human justice is avoided, there's always the God of justice who will do what is necessary. And that is the reason why in the New Testament, divine vengeance is sometimes praised. We can't experience that mostly in Western context, but in other contexts, non-Western contexts, divine vengeance is much more a necessity. And that's what, with a citation in which I close off my webinar, my story, a citation of the Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf, who has experienced the necessity of divine vengeance in the Balkan War. He states, "My thesis that the practice of non-violence requires a belief in divine vengeance will be unpopular with many Christians, especially theologians in the West. To the person who is inclined to dismiss it, I suggest imagining that you are delivering a lecture in a war zone. Among your listeners are people whose cities and villages have been first plundered, then burned and leveled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit, and the topic of the lecture, a Christian attitude toward violence. And the thesis, we should not retaliate since God is perfect, non-coercive love. Soon you will discover that it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of the thesis that human non-violence corresponds to God's refusal to judge. In a scorched land, soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die. And as one watches it die, one will do well to reflect about many other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind." Thus, although divine vengeance as a notion is sensitive in our minds and eyes, I hope to have shown that divine vengeance in the New Testament, what it entails, and that it deserves the place in theology of nowadays. I want to thank you.
Thank you, Arjan, also on behalf of Resilience for this really insightful content that you gave us into the research that you have done in the past years. And I do realize that the topic and all the content can cause a lot of reactions, maybe need more reflections, but I can also imagine that at the moment, people attending this webinar have certain questions for Arjan. So if you have anything you would like to discuss or ask Arjan for further explanation, we will have some time for it. The floor is yours. Just open your mic and start talking. No one? You need some more time for reflection, maybe, on all the aspects that Arjan mentioned?
It's
I have
always
one question
Yes,
for
please.
clarification, just because you spoke about vengeance in the Old Testament being always put in the context of covenant, and then you mentioned something about a family relationship, and that wasn't entirely clear for me. Would you say that the covenant relationship of God with His people is like a family relationship? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And why? Because God speaks about, I will be your God and you will be my people. So where did you get that family relationship from?
Yeah, good question. There are certain texts in the Old Testament in which God is presented as the Father. Hosea 11, for instance, is an example that God and children, God is the Father, and the people of Israel are his children. And covenant is also put in terms of family, and that does not contradict anything of God's majesty or highness, because family in antiquity had the father was the most important and the most powerful in the family. So covenant and family are not a contradiction, but the covenant is some call it relational, but I may say it's more a familial. It's God who reigns, who is king, but who is also father of the people of Israel. And as father, he gives and he gives the gift of blessings and that sort of thing, and he cares for his children, the people of Israel. So I think Hosea 11 is an example that the covenant is a familial relationship, and that the relationship between God and his people can be formulated in family terms.
Thank you. And then I had an additional question to follow up on that. So would divine vengeance, does it make a difference? That's family relationship, because would it be different if that family relationship wasn't there? It was just a king and people relationship?
Yeah, good question. Thank you very much. I can even state that if there was no family relationship, there was no notion of divine vengeance. I just briefly said it, but divine vengeance in general was something which was an obligation of the family. So if, for instance, a family member was murdered, the family had to take care of business, had to avenge the honor and the name of the victim, but also of the family in general. So if the notion of covenant and family relationship was absent in the Old Testament, there was no vengeance. There was no idea of God avenging, because there was no legitimate context for it.
Okay, that's much more clear. Thank you for clarifying.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Actually, the previous question was somehow related to mine as well. So would you say theologically that vengeance is in the background when it comes to atonement theology? So I guess the question is somehow, well, part of the question is how vengeance and divine wrath are related, and usually we say the gospel is that God is angry with sinners. So in that, well, the question is, would that mean in terms of vengeance, God must avenge for his own, for his namesake, and must punish the sinner, and then Christ is taking God's vengeance upon himself? Is that how would you relate vengeance, if at all, to atonement, especially because you just said vengeance somehow presupposes a familial relationship, but God with the sinner before the cross doesn't have, I guess, a familial relationship, but we are his enemies. So how are those things, how can they fit together?
Yeah, good question. Well, when it comes to vengeance, I think there's a how can I formulate it well? Divine vengeance, in my view, is especially focused on the people of God. So more on the community of Christ followers, but sometimes in general, but mostly on the Christian community. Because they are in a covenantal relationship. and the tension of the present. They must live their life according to the holy statutes of God, of the law of Christ, Galatians 6, or the law of the Spirit in Romans 8. And atonement, I relate to the gift of God in Christ. So yes, there's the relationship between that. The gift of God in Christ is given. There's atonement. There's a possibility, and we have to take in view that the New Testament writings are written to firstly to the church and to the church members, and they are put in because they have believed. They are members of the Christian community. They are placed in because of also of baptism into the covenantal community. And the tension of divine vengeance is that they must persevere, and that God has atoned sin. Not that God could exact his vengeance, but he has firstly given his son for unworthy people. And divine vengeance is, may I formulate it as the step after atonement, which because it's an eschatological phenomenon, God's vengeance is coming in the future, and it will be. It's assured that it will come in the future, and the tension and the reason why it is formulated in the New Testament is that the Christian the Christians are admonished to go the paths of Jesus Christ, and that the atonement is the gift of God to the Christian communities, to the churches. And that honor, that gift, must be reciprocated with a holy life, with sanctification. And if one when it comes when the day of the Lord is present and becoming reality, and the Christians are not holy, blameless, sanctified, they will be punished with divine vengeance. So that's the way I see divine vengeance used in the New Testament. Not really closely related to the notion of atonement, but as the necessary consequence of atonement, as I may formulate that.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Can I ask about the divine vengeance that you also point with the relation with the government, that they can be used as an instrument to an immanent aspect of the vengeance also?
Yeah.
Is that also something that can be like the reason for government exercise justice, or maybe even do something? Can government really claim as an instrument of divine vengeance?
Yeah, good question. First, I have to say that Paul does not provide a certain political theology in Romans 13, but I think he addresses a pastoral situation in Romans 12 and 13, namely that of oppression and suffering, and also the lurking danger that suffering leads to despair, and despair leads to desperate behavior as vengeance and violence. And that Paul says in Romans 12:19, do not avenge yourself, do not fall into despair and desperate behavior, because there's a God who avenges, and that God is also already making his vengeance explicit in the present punishment of evil. That is not full, that is not perfect, and we have to also take into mind that the Roman authorities were not really nice to Christians and Christian communities. But Paul says, because the authorities are a creation of God and are the structures which God has inserted into the world, they are the servants of God. Paul says explicitly in Romans 13. They are the servants of God who distribute blessing and evil. So just to take away the notion that that the Christians in Romans are left alone, that they must do whatever it takes for themselves. They are provided with the notion that God avenges, and He already avenges incompletely, but presently explicitly in the justice system of the present.
And is it also possible for the reason maybe the theory of just war and something like that from the government?
Yeah, I'm quite hesitant to do that, because I think Romans 13 is not a step to political theology. I think we first have to consider it as as is the whole New Testament, as the way that the followers of Jesus Christ are pastorally guided, and not as a certain big philosophy or that sort of thing, but as the way that God, through the writers of the New Testament, guides His people. So when it comes to theories of just war and that sort of thing, I'm quite hesitant to really connect that explicitly with Romans 13. I think when it comes to just war, if you take that step into consideration, I think there is some legitimacy to say just war, and that it is also with other texts as God, as authorities doing justice in the world, as God has given them authority to do. But that must be a fuller story than already only based on Romans 13. But I think there's some line to just war theories and that sort of thing. But that will be a whole other discussion, which also brings us in all sorts of philosophical and more practical theological waters.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think we have room for one more question. So if there's something you would like to discuss now or ask to Arjan, please do not hesitate to do it. No one. Arjan, would you like to say some concluding words now?
Yeah, I want to I want to thank you for your presence and for the patience to listen to my much too loaded story, and I hope you have learned something, maybe one thing, or maybe you've sketched the whole story. But I want to thank you for your presence and for your time to listen.
It was a pleasure having you at the Resilience webinar, Arjan.